July 28, 1944. 0617 hours. Eastern outskirts of St. Lo, Normandy. The morning fog sat low over the hedgerow lines. The air smelled of wet soil and cordite. Allied units pushed mile by mile through fields cut by high earth walls. Every lane, farm road, and orchard hid German guns. Officers on the German side used these blind angles to move without detection. They shifted fire, redirected squads, and shaped each fight with speed. Their presence kept Allied advances slow and costly. Corporal Emil Kovac moved with a forward observation group from the 29th Infantry Division. He was 28. He carried a field notebook, a damaged M49 spotting scope, and a quiet focus that the other men trusted. Emil grew up in Chicago. He ran a small shop that repaired cameras, film shutters, and precision lenses. He had steady hands. He understood how small mechanical parts behaved under pressure. He treated every tool with patience. That habit stayed with him in France. The hedgerow fighting punished mistakes. German officers often stayed behind bramble screens or narrow timber gaps. They watched over their men from short distances. They kept machine gun crews moving. They used short calls and hand signals. Allied maps gave little help in this terrain. Lines on paper did not reflect the real angles. A lookout needed seconds to act. If he failed to find the officer, the fight dragged on. More shells fell. More riflemen took hits trying to push forward. Emil had seen this pattern repeat. A platoon advanced on a hedgerow. German rifles opened fire. Someone shouted contact left. The officer vanished behind brush. A mortar crew needed a new correction. A sniper needed a clear target. The officer slipped away again. Casualties rose. Progress fell. Emil watched these scenes with frustration that grew each day. He saw how a small moment of delay could cost lives. The M49 spotting scope had taken a fall 2 weeks earlier. A rifleman had dropped it during a fast withdrawal from a farm lane. The internal shutter housing loosened. Most men ignored the flaw. The scope still worked for observation. No one cared about a bit of internal play. Emil did. He opened the tube in a barn one evening. He checked the shutter blades and the thin internal guide. He noticed a small, irregular gap near the shutter's resting point. It let a sliver of stray light escape. The gap was tiny but predictable. It behaved the same way each time the shutter snapped back into position. The gap triggered a thought. Emil remembered a device he once repaired in his shop. A photographer had brought him a camera with a damaged flash capsule. A spring inside had released a trace of colored powder when the shutter hit a specific point. The leak marked film frames during a test run. The idea returned to him now. If he could harness the small gap in the M49, he could use it to release a very light trace of colored smoke at the exact moment the scope aligned on a target. The smoke would stay near his own position. It would not reveal him to the enemy. It would not drift far. It would simply give a coded visual point for artillery crews behind him. Observation teams would match the puff to prearranged signals. They could drop fire faster and with more accuracy. He worked in silence for several nights. He kept the scope near a small oil lamp. He removed screws with a pocket tool. He shaped a tiny spring with a file borrowed from a mechanic in the next tent. He used a spent rifle primer cup to hold a pinch of colored powder. The cup fit cleanly inside the scope body. He placed it so that when the shutter closed and tension reached the gap, the spring would trigger and release a focused puff. The puff appeared beside the observer, not on the target. It was visible enough for trained eyes but faint enough to blend with the normal smoke from indirect fire. He tested it behind a hedgerow that faced an abandoned farmhouse. He aligned the scope on a cracked window 35 meters away. He breathed steady. He adjusted his elbows in the dirt. When he clicked the shutter, a thin wisp of colored smoke appeared at his side. Small, precise, controlled. He wrote the result in his notebook. Distance good. Angle stable. Powder release consistent. He tried again. Same result. He nodded once. This tool would help observers call fire on enemy officers as soon as they saw them. No delay. No need to shout. No need to guess coordinates under stress. The artillery battery behind them only needed the puff code and the line of aim. In the days that followed, Emil carried the modified scope into the field. He did not mention the device to the sergeant. He wanted a real moment to prove its value. That moment came on a slow advance through a narrow lane east of St. Lo. German fire came from a line of tangled brush behind a broken stone fence. A machine gun team pinned the lead squad. Mortar shells fell short as forward observers struggled to find the officer directing the fire. The enemy used the hedgerow gaps with skill. Each time a shadow moved, it vanished again. The men near Emile cursed the delay. He scanned the brush for a full minute. He cleared sweat from his right eye. Then he caught a brief motion behind a low fork in the hedge. The shape held a field cap. It leaned forward at a careful angle. The posture showed control. Emile centered the scope. His breath steadied. He locked the shutter. A faint puff rose at his side. The signal man behind him saw it. He relayed the coded mark to the mortar crew. 22 seconds later, 3 rounds fell into the exact section of brush where the officer had moved. The machine gun fire collapsed. A second burst of Allied rifle fire advanced the line. Men rushed forward behind the new gap. They reached the fence before the German squads could regroup. The sergeant turned to Emile with a hard look. He had seen the puff. He had noticed the timing. He asked how Emile had marked the officer so fast. Emile kept his tone calm. He explained the shutter gap. He explained the spring. He explained the powder. The sergeant listened with doubt at first. Then he looked at the captured position and the silent machine gun. His doubt faded. He told Emile to keep the device ready for the next advance. Word began to move through the small teams. Not official. Not written. Only spoken between men who needed every edge. They asked Emile to show them how the puff looked. They watched him align the scope. They nodded when they saw the result. A tool that marked a target without noise or exposure meant seconds saved. Seconds saved meant lives saved. This was only the beginning. The advance toward St. Lo continued with slow pressure. Each hedgerow created a new fight. German officers stayed disciplined. They shifted squads with short commands. They relied on the terrain to stay unseen. Allied forces needed fast identification to cut leadership before each position hardened. The modified shutter gap device began to show its value in these tight engagements. Emile stayed close to the lead squads. He kept the scope wrapped in canvas to hide its altered parts. He moved with the observation teams. He watched the terrain with the same patience he once used when checking lens alignment in his shop. 2 days after the first field use, Emile's group reached a junction lined with tall grass and broken stone walls. The platoon halted. A German sniper had opened fire minutes earlier and forced the scouts back. The officer, directing the enemy squad, stayed hidden behind a camouflaged net. Riflemen heard short commands but could not locate the source. Each delay forced the unit to reposition. The terrain narrowed. A stalled advance here threatened the entire regimental push. Emile dropped to one knee. He unfolded the spotting scope. The shutter felt stable. The internal spring rested with the right tension. He scanned the netting. He saw no clear silhouette. Only slight depressions in the foliage. He changed angle. He checked the far left side. No movement. He tracked right. He paused as a faint shift appeared at the base of a tree trunk. It was not a full figure. Only a slight change in contrast. A shadow that leaned forward for an instant. An officer checking the squad's spacing. He centered the scope. He controlled his breath. When the shutter snapped, the coded puff appeared at his side. The signal operator behind him noted the color and sent the correction to the mortar crew. The enemy sniper fired again, missing by inches. The correction was already on the way. 2 mortar rounds landed along the tree line. The netting lifted into the air under the blast. A third round cratered the officer's position. Riflemen advanced immediately and secured the junction. The sergeant walked past the smoke and broken branches. He looked at Emile without speaking. He studied the scope. Emile held it steady. The sergeant nodded once. Approval came without theatrics. The team knew they had gained a reliable method to locate enemy leadership in seconds. Each successful strike increased trust in the device. That night, they gathered near a small field kitchen. Rain tapped on the tent canvas. The men sat in a circle with tin cups. A corporal from the mortar team asked Emile how he controlled the smoke release. Emile explained the shutter gap again. He described how the spring triggered only at a specific alignment. He pointed out that the puff never reached enemy lines. It remained close enough for observers to see but faint enough to blend with battlefield smoke. They asked how often the powder could be replaced. Emile showed a small pouch of color capsules wrapped in cloth. He carried enough for several engagements. The platoon lieutenant joined them. He asked for a demonstration. Emile stepped outside the tent. He pointed the scope at a wooden post 30 meters away. The shutter clicked. A small puff rose through the rain. The lieutenant's expression changed from curiosity to calculation. He saw potential. Faster fire missions. Rapid sniper adjustments. Less exposure for forward observers. He told Emile to keep refining the system. If it continued to perform, he would recommend quiet distribution to select teams. The next day brought heavier resistance. German units defending the approaches to St. Lo fought with determination. Their officers shifted squads through small farm lanes, using smoke screens and timed volleys to delay Allied gains. Emil's group advanced along a narrow stretch of road bordered by high hedges. The air grew thick with dust and burnt powder. A machine gun fired from an unknown angle. Riflemen hugged the earth. The lieutenant ordered Emil forward. He crawled along a shallow ditch until he reached a gap in the hedge. He raised the scope. He scanned the far end of the lane. The enemy used a smoke grenade to cover movement. The cloud drifted in uneven layers. If an officer moved behind the haze, normal identification became impossible. The device offered a solution. Emil looked through the shifting gray. He saw nothing at first. Then he noticed a faint vertical motion near a low bench of broken stone. It was subtle. Too subtle for most eyes. He centered the shutter. The device fired its puff. The signal operator relayed the coded mark. The mortar team adjusted. Within seconds, impacts landed across the stone bench. Allied rifles followed the blast. The machine gun fire stopped. Infantry moved through the smoke. They found the officer's map case and signal whistle among the debris. The lieutenant pulled Emil aside. He spoke with quiet force. The division needed this tool. He said they could not formalize it yet. Supply officers would reject anything unofficial. But he wanted Emil to work with 2 other observers to share the technique. He emphasized secrecy. If the Germans understood the system, they could adjust. If they stayed unaware, Allied command teams kept the advantage. Emil agreed. His goal was simple. Reduce delay. Save men. Push the line forward. As days passed, Emil refined the internal spring tension. He adjusted the capsule seating to ensure consistent pressure. He tested the mechanism during short halts. He recorded each result. The device gained a reputation among the small circles who saw it work. They spoke of the silent mark that cut seconds from fire missions. They trusted its precision. During a night advance, the unit moved through an orchard. Moonlight filtered through branches. German scouts fired sporadic shots to slow them. Officers on the enemy side shifted between trees, using shadows to break identification. Emil followed the scouts. He crouched behind a low stone trough. He raised the scoped lens toward a dark cluster of branches. A small movement caught his eye near a leaning apple tree. He aligned the shutter. The puff appeared. The signal passed down the line. Artillery from the supporting battery struck the orchard's edge with tight grouping. The officer directing the German squad fell in the first impact. The squad broke. Allied riflemen advanced without losing momentum. The lieutenant credited the fast mark for the collapse of resistance in that sector. Emil felt the weight of each engagement. He kept a small list of men wounded in operations where no officer had been found in time. He compared that list to the new advances. The number of casualties dropped. Fire missions became shorter. Riflemen moved with more confidence when they knew leadership on the enemy side could be identified quickly. Each day, the reputation of the loose shutter gap spread quietly. Observers from neighboring companies whispered about it. They asked to see it. They asked if Emil could modify their scopes. He made adjustments when he could. He kept notes on each unit that received a modified device. He wanted consistency. If every scope behaved the same way, observers could rely on timing and alignment across the front. The push toward St. Lo entered its final stages. German command networks grew strained. Officers moved more often to maintain control. Their increased movement created more opportunities for detection. Emil's device gained more value with each shift. The men began referring to it with simple terms. Some called it the shutter mark. Others called it the smoke cue. A scout named it the gap signal. Emil did not care which name stayed. The only thing that mattered was its accuracy. The final week of July brought heavier pressure across the St. Lo sector. Allied forces pushed along narrow corridors shaped by hedgerows, broken farm lanes, and scattered stone outbuildings. Every position demanded caution. German officers adapted as losses rose. They changed their patterns. They moved faster between cover. They relied on smoke screens to hide direction changes. Their goal was simple. Delay the Allied push long enough for new reserves to reorganize. Forward observers like Emil had to counter these changes with speed. His shutter gap device became a silent asset that removed guesswork from chaotic fights. On the morning of July 30th, the division advanced through an area known to the locals as La Croix Ridge. The ridge curved gently, forming a shallow bowl. German units held the far bank of the bowl with machine guns, rifles, and a mortar team positioned behind a collapsed barn. Officers directed the fight from holes cut into the hedgerow roots. Every few seconds they shifted positions. The movement remained small. Only slight angle changes. The officers hid behind dirt ridges that blocked direct lines of sight. An Allied squad tried to push left but took fire from a concealed gun. A sergeant motioned for Emil. They needed the officer's position. Without it, another move would cost men. Emil crawled through a ditch filled with stagnant water. He kept the scope above the surface. He reached a low rise and positioned himself behind it. He wiped moisture from the lens. He scanned the hedgerow wall. He saw broken branches that formed an irregular dark patch. Something about the patch felt controlled. Too clean for natural growth. He watched for movement. The officer emerged for 1 second. A hand lifted a field glass. The shadow shifted. Emil aligned the scope. The shutter snapped. The puff rose beside him. The signal man relayed the code. The artillery battery responded with a precise strike. The blast took out the officer's hollow. Allied riflemen pressed forward. The machine gun line collapsed. The ridge fell within minutes. As they regrouped, the battalion intelligence officer approached Emil. He had heard of the device from 3 different platoons. He asked to see it. Emil handed over the scope. The officer examined it, surprised at the simplicity. He asked how long it took to build. Emil answered with direct numbers. He explained the spring tension and powder load. The officer nodded. He told Emil that word of the tool would stay within selected units. They could not risk supply officers confiscating modified equipment. But they could train specific teams to use the technique. Later that afternoon, another engagement tested the device's limit. The unit moved through an open pasture with scattered hay bales. German troops retreated toward a small farmhouse, using the bales as partial cover. A group of officers moved behind a stone fence. They directed a counterfire pattern that pinned Allied squads at the pasture's edge. Emil sprinted low and slid behind an overturned hay rake. The enemy fired sporadic bursts. Dust rose in thin clouds. He unfolded the scope. The shutter shook slightly from the sprint. He steadied it with his left hand. He scanned the stone fence. The officers crouched low. One officer leaned forward for a moment to issue a short instruction. Emil centered the shutter. The puff fired. The signal passed. Mortars fell within seconds. Dust lifted from the fence. The officers dispersed in panic. Riflemen advanced and broke their defensive line. After the fight, Emil checked the internal mechanism. The sprint had shifted the primer cup slightly. He made a quick adjustment with a small screwdriver he kept in his pouch. He reset the spring. He replaced the powder capsule. He scribbled new notes about shock sensitivity. The device was reliable under normal movement but needed reinforcement after heavy jarring. He added this to his refinement list. That evening, the lieutenant requested a formal demonstration for 2 neighboring companies. They gathered behind a collapsed barn. The sun dropped behind the ridge. The men formed a semicircle around Emil. He explained the mechanism. He showed how the shutter gap triggered the puff. He emphasized that the smoke never traveled toward the enemy. It stayed near the observer and served only as a coded reference for artillery or sniper teams. The officers listened carefully. They saw the advantage. They understood how much time it saved. Emil demonstrated by aiming at a broken wagon wheel. The puff rose. He repeated the test. Same result. The lieutenant turned to the observers and told them to memorize the timing. He explained which color powders meant which fire mission adjustment. Each color corresponded to a different artillery pattern. They practiced the signal relay process. They rehearsed scenarios. They built a system that relied on speed rather than lengthy map checks. In the days that followed, Emil worked with 2 selected observers to replicate the modification across several M49 scopes. Each scope required careful adjustment. He taught them how to align the spring. He showed them how to seat the powder capsule. He explained how to avoid overloading the mechanism. Too much powder would create a puff that rose too high. Too little created unreliable visibility. He insisted on consistency. If all observers followed the same method, artillery teams could rely on identical performance. The fight toward St. Lo tightened. The city itself had become a network of ruins. Walls leaned at odd angles. Smoke drifted from shell holes. German officers used darkened interiors to issue orders. Their movements became faster. They pushed their men through broken alleys and collapsed stairwells. Forward observers had only seconds to catch those movements before the officers vanished deeper inside. Emil moved through the outskirts with his team. They approached a row of damaged houses. The platoon took fire from a second-floor window. The officer directing the defense stayed inside the building. No one could pinpoint his location. Rifleman tried to mark muzzle flashes. The flashes moved. The officer shifted positions every few seconds. They needed precision to end the fight quickly. Emil took cover behind a toppled kitchen stove. He raised the scope toward the building. The interior remained dark. He scanned the doorframe. He saw nothing. He checked the broken shutters. A faint ripple of movement appeared behind the left shutter. It was small. The officer leaned to check the outside line. Emil aligned the scope. The puff rose. The signal transmitted. Mortars struck the front wall with tight placement. The upper floor collapsed. Allied troops advanced and cleared the lower rooms with minimal losses. Inside the remains of the building, the platoon found a German map spread across a table with markings of Allied positions. They found signal codes and written orders. The elimination of the officer prevented a coordinated withdrawal. The lieutenant told Emil that the strike changed the pace of the entire block's capture. Later, Emil updated his notes. The shutter gap worked well in low light. The smoke puff remained visible even at dusk. He added details about the angle needed when marking targets inside buildings. He refined the device again, tightening 2 screws to improve shutter travel. He filed down the primer cup edge to reduce friction. The result increased consistency. At the end of the day, the men rested behind a rubble wall. The sun dipped low. The air smelled of dust and burnt wood. The sergeant sat beside Emil. He said the men trusted the device. They saw its results. They counted fewer wounded when it was used. He told Emil that the tool changed the way they fought. Emil listened without reaction. He focused on the next engagement. He knew the device needed to work every time. There was no margin for failure in this terrain. The last day of July opened with a heavy bombardment across the outskirts of St. Lo. Allied divisions prepared for a coordinated push, intended to breach the final defensive ring. Smoke drifted over the shattered buildings. Trees leaned at sharp angles. The echoes of artillery rolled through the valleys. Teams moved with discipline. Forward observers advanced in staggered groups. Emil stayed with the lead element of his company. His modified spotting scope hung from his shoulder under a cloth sleeve that protected the delicate mechanism. German officers adapted to the new tempo. They reduced exposure even further. They used short movements to keep their lines coherent. They shifted fire teams between broken walls and cellar doors. They trusted the debris-filled terrain to disrupt Allied sight lines. They knew that losing officers in these final blocks would accelerate collapse. Emil felt the shift in enemy behavior. Movement became sharper. Targets appeared for fractions of seconds. The margin for error narrowed. During the morning advance, the company reached a cluster of ruined farm structures arranged along a sunken lane. German fire came from 2 angles, forcing the platoon to split behind rubble piles. The officer responsible for the machine gun line stayed hidden in the upper floor of a half-collapsed barn. Riflemen could see muzzle flashes but not the position from which orders came. Without neutralizing that commander, the machine gun would continue to pin the platoon. Emil crawled along a ditch filled with broken tiles and soot. He steadied himself behind a wheelbarrow turned on its side. He raised the scope. The barn's interior appeared dark. Loose boards dangled from the rafters. A shadow shifted near the rear loft. A hand moved. The profile leaned forward to give an order to the gun crew below. Emil centered the shutter. The puff released. The signal operator behind him relayed the code. Mortar rounds hit the loft with accurate spacing. The command voice fell silent. The machine gun slowed then stopped. Platoon riflemen advanced across the lane. As they secured the area, the lieutenant approached. He studied the collapsed loft. He noted how quickly the resistance broke once the officer was removed. He told Emil that division command had passed word, quietly, of the effect observed in this sector. Several forward teams wanted to learn the technique. Emil agreed to train them when rotation allowed even brief rest. The next engagement tested the device under shifting smoke conditions. German units deployed multiple smoke grenades to disrupt Allied line of sight as they retreated through narrow alleys. The smoke spread across intersections, forming thick layers that hid small movements. Forward observers struggled to track enemy officers. The company halted near a brick workshop with shattered windows. German fire continued from a stable on the far side of an alley. The officer's voice could be heard in short bursts. His exact location remained uncertain. Emil knelt beside a stone water trough. He lifted the scope. The alley was a corridor of swirling gray. He lowered the magnification and searched for slight variations in movement. He saw a faint outline near the stable's side door. It shifted backward. The smoke thickened again. He waited. He adjusted for angle. A second faint motion appeared. He aligned the shutter. The puff rose. The signal passed. Mortars landed across the stable. The officer's position collapsed. The fire from that sector ended, and the company advanced. The men saw this result clearly. They understood that the device worked even when terrain conditions broke normal visibility. They appreciated the precision. They trusted the tool because it removed delay from chaotic moments when hesitation caused casualties. During a short halt, Emile sat behind a brick wall and examined the scope. He checked the spring. He checked the capsule slot. Both performed well despite the intense shaking from crawling through rubble. He used a small cloth to clear soot from the lens. He added a note in his book. The shutter gap responded best when the interior tube stayed dry. Moisture slowed the spring's release rate. He began carrying a small cloth inside his jacket pocket to dry the mechanism quickly when needed. By midday, the company moved into a denser section of ruins. Buildings stood at irregular angles. Staircases jutted into the open. Smoke rose from shell holes. German officers used these structures to direct retreating squads. They stayed in upper floors for moments, then moved down to courtyards. They adjusted fire lines. The complexity of movement made identification difficult for any observer relying on standard signals. Emile moved between collapsed door frames and piles of bricks. He used low walls for cover. Rifle fire echoed from every direction. The sergeant motioned for him to take position behind a demolished doorway. A German officer had been seen issuing commands from an upper floor in a damaged apartment building. They needed a precise mark before attempting to breach. He raised the scope toward the structure. The window frames were reduced to jagged shapes. Cloth hung from a broken beam. He scanned each opening. A movement appeared behind the second window on the right. The officer leaned forward to signal a squad near the courtyard. Emile centered the shutter. The puff fired. The signal moved instantly to the mortar team positioned on the ridge behind them. Impacts hit the upper floor. The officer fell. The squad below lost coordination. Allied troops breached the courtyard and secured the building. After the assault, the sergeant examined the window. He shook his head at the difficulty of spotting the figure in the shifting dust and rubble. He said that without the mark, they would have lost more men pushing into a fortified position with unknown command layout. Emile took a moment to reinforce the shutter components. He tightened the spring seat. He checked alignment by aiming at a distant lamppost. The mechanism responded well. Later in the afternoon, the unit encountered a rare counterattack. German forces attempted to reclaim a block near the western edge of the ruins. Officers on the enemy side coordinated the push from behind a line of broken carts piled against a wall. They controlled the counterattack with strict timing. Allied squads fell back behind debris piles while they reorganized. Emile crawled behind an overturned table near what had once been a bakery. Flour dust coated the ground. Smoke drifted at knee height. He raised the scope. He scanned the broken carts. The officers stayed low. Their movement blended with the debris. He waited. He scanned again. A figure rose slightly to observe the street. Emile aligned the shutter. The puff rose. The signal man relayed the code to the artillery team positioned on elevated ground. The strike landed with tight grouping. The counterattack collapsed at once. The lieutenant moved to Emile's position. He said the division would reach central St. Lo by nightfall if momentum continued. He told Emile that the shutter gap technique had become a central part of their strategy. Without it, each block would take longer to secure. He instructed Emile to conserve powder and maintain his mechanism with care. A new wave of combat waited ahead. As the men rested briefly behind a stable wall, Emile checked his supply of capsules. He had enough for several more marks. He cleaned the mechanism again. He wrote new notes. He looked at the line of ruined buildings ahead. He knew the next phase would push them deeper into terrain where every shadow might conceal an officer. He prepared to move with the same steady focus he had carried since the beginning. The final push into central St. Lo began under fading light. The sun dipped behind jagged rooftops. Smoke from earlier bombardments created an orange haze over the shattered streets. The company advanced through a corridor of debris, broken beams, and cratered pavement. Every intersection presented risk. German officers used interior shadows and collapsed doorways to control defensive pockets. Their communications grew frantic. Their movements became sharper. They sensed that the line could not hold much longer. Emile stayed close to the forward observers as they moved through the ruined blocks. He kept the modified M49 tucked under his arm. The shutter mechanism had survived days of harsh use. He checked the spring tension each time they paused. He ensured the powder capsules remained dry. He understood how important the device had become. The platoon relied on it for rapid precision in the tightest moments. The first engagement of the evening occurred near a collapsed church. The tower lay across the street, forming an improvised barrier. German riflemen fired from the nave through holes punched in the stone walls. Their officer directed fire from a pulpit platform that still stood despite the destruction. His voice carried through the cracked interior. Allied forces needed to remove him before pushing through the broken doorway. Emil took position behind a slab of fallen masonry. He raised the scope toward the interior. Dust filled the church. Flickering light from burning debris created shifting shadows. Emil scanned the platform. He saw a faint outline move behind a section of carved wood. The officer lifted a hand to signal a change of fire. Emil aligned the shutter. The puff rose beside him. The signal man relayed the code. The mortar team fired 3 rounds. The impact struck the pulpit platform with precision. The officer fell instantly. Riflemen pushed forward. They entered the church and neutralized the remaining defenders. The sergeant turned to Emil and nodded. The fight that could have dragged for minutes ended in less than 30 seconds. The unit moved deeper into the city. Streets narrowed. Walls leaned inward. Smoke hung between buildings like low clouds. German officers used the smoke to reposition. They issued orders in rushed bursts. Emil tracked these movements with steady patience. His eyes adjusted to each shift in contrast. His focus stayed locked on subtle clues that revealed a commander's presence. At the intersection of Rue du Marquet, the platoon halted again. Fire from a machine gun nest struck the lead squad from an undetermined angle. The gunner's accuracy indicated officer oversight. Allied riflemen could not identify the command element. The enemy used a half-collapsed storefront for concealment. Shattered shelves and tangled iron supports created complex shadows. Emil crawled to a position between 2 overturned carts. He steadied his elbows. He raised the scope and scanned the storefront. He traced the broken door frame. He followed the collapsed ceiling beam. He watched the far corner. A shadow moved slightly. It was controlled motion, not random shifting. The officer leaned forward to correct the gun's angle. Emil centered the shutter. The puff rose. The signal went through. Mortars landed along the storefront. The machine gun fire stopped. The squad advanced with minimal resistance. Further down the block, the unit encountered another fortified position. German forces held a courtyard surrounded by 3-story buildings. Their officer directed movement from a balcony partially collapsed by earlier shelling. He kept shifting from one side of the balcony to the other. He used the broken railing as visual cover. His position made normal identification almost impossible. Emil crouched behind a low fountain wall. He lifted the scope. The officer appeared only in fragments. A shoulder. A sleeve. The corner of a field cap. Each glimpse lasted 1 second or less. Emil waited for a consistent angle. He exhaled slowly. The officer leaned outward to shout an order. Emil aligned the shutter. The puff rose. The code traveled instantly. The mortar fire dropped with remarkable accuracy. The balcony buckled. The officer fell into the courtyard. The defensive layout collapsed. Allied soldiers crossed into the courtyard and secured the block. One of the riflemen remarked that without the shutter mark, they would have spent 20 minutes trying to pinpoint the officer. Instead, the block fell in moments. As night thickened, the city grew quieter. German resistance concentrated in smaller pockets. Officers became even harder to detect. They used narrow stairwells and short hallways to maintain control. They spoke softly to avoid revealing positions. This forced Emil to rely on the faintest signs. A shift of rubble. A flicker of light on cloth. A silhouette passing behind a splintered doorway. At one intersection, German troops attempted a final organized withdrawal. Their officer directed the retreat through an alley between a bakery and a carpenter's shop. The alley was filled with smoke. The officer appeared only as a faint figure moving between boards. Emil positioned himself near a broken pillar. He watched the alley carefully. He saw a brief contrast shift as the officer leaned forward to check the Allied movement. Emil centered the shutter. The puff appeared. The signal operator relayed it instantly. Artillery struck the alley's entrance. The withdrawal collapsed. German troops scattered in confusion. The company advanced without losing momentum. After the engagement, Emil checked the mechanism again. The spring remained strong. The powder chamber performed reliably despite soot buildup. He made a note to clean the tube thoroughly once they reached a safer position. The next engagement pushed them toward the city center. Ruins surrounded them on all sides. The air smelled of plaster dust and burnt wood. German officers used hidden alcoves and upper-level balconies to control the shrinking perimeter. Their movements became frantic. Emil moved alongside the lieutenant. They reached a vantage point behind a series of broken stones. A German officer emerged briefly from a second-floor window to redirect the squad's fallback route. The moment was fleeting. Emil caught it. He raised the scope. He centered the shutter. The puff triggered. The code went through. Mortars struck the building. The upper floor collapsed. The defense in that block ended immediately. The lieutenant placed a hand on Emil's shoulder. He said that the device had become a deciding factor in their ability to break each defensive pocket. He told Emil that command would soon review a report about the tool's performance. For now, secrecy remained necessary. They needed every advantage intact until the city was fully secured. As they moved toward their next objective, Emil paused for a moment. He looked at his scope. Its metal casing was scratched and dented. The shutter plate bore signs of wear. The spring mechanism had been stressed through continuous use. Yet it continued to function with precision. He felt the responsibility of every moment it had been relied upon. The night advance continued. The men prepared for the next block. Emil adjusted his strap, tightened the screws on the shutter housing, and readied himself once more. The city still held pockets of resistance. Officers still moved through the shadows. The device would be needed again before dawn. The final block of St. Lo came into view just after 0300 hours. The night pressed down hard. Smoke drifted through the air in slow sheets. Fires burned inside ruined homes, sending faint orange light across the broken streets. The push had reduced German positions to isolated clusters. Yet these clusters fought with determination. Their officers moved with the urgency of men trying to hold a collapsing line together for a few more hours. The company crept forward through a narrow passage formed by fallen walls. Every sound mattered. Every movement needed caution. Emil followed behind the scouts. His eyes remained fixed on the shadows. The modified M49 hung ready in his hands. He checked the shutter tension again. The mechanism remained stable. His notebook pages had filled with observations across the past week. He carried the knowledge of each engagement. He knew the device's strengths. He knew its limits. He understood how much difference it made in these ruined streets. The platoon reached a fork where two narrow lanes split. German troops held a 3-story building overlooking both lanes. They had fortified the lower level with sandbags and debris. Their officer directed the defense from a corner room on the second floor. His voice echoed faintly through broken glass. Riflemen tried to pinpoint him but failed. The silhouette remained hidden behind toppled beams. The lieutenant turned to Emil. He pointed toward a demolished chimney that provided partial cover. Emil crawled forward. He positioned himself behind the chimney base. He raised the scope. The window frames of the second floor were jagged and uneven. Shadows shifted inside. A faint movement appeared for half a second. The officer leaned forward to shout a correction. Emil centered the shutter. The puff rose at his side. The signal passed instantly. Mortars struck the upper floor. The room collapsed. The officer fell with it. The sandbag line below wavered. Allied riflemen surged forward. They cleared the ground floor with precise fire. The building fell in minutes. The unit regrouped behind the rubble. The sergeant gave a quiet nod of approval. The men understood that without the mark, they would have spent valuable minutes trading fire with a coordinated enemy. Instead, leadership fell early, reducing the fight to manageable resistance. The advance continued into the last major intersection before central St. Lo. Debris narrowed the path. German forces held their final positions. Officers moved between shattered doorways to guide the remnants of their defense. They attempted to conceal their presence by limiting exposure to split seconds. They issued orders through shorthand gestures to avoid detection. But in this environment, even the smallest misstep could reveal them. At the corner of a ruined tailor's shop, the platoon halted again. A German officer coordinated fire from inside a collapsed workshop directly ahead. The structure provided substantial cover. Dust and smoke spilled out from the broken roof. The officer used the shadows to hide his movements. Riflemen attempted to flank but were pinned. The delay threatened momentum. Emil moved into a shallow depression caused by a shell crater. He steadied his elbows on the crater rim. He raised the scope. He scanned the workshop interior. Nothing moved for 10 seconds. Then a faint shift appeared behind a stack of charred boards. The officer leaned forward slightly. Emil centered the shutter. The puff issued. The signal traveled. Mortars struck the workshop. The charred boards collapsed. Allied riflemen rushed forward and secured the area. As they advanced deeper into the block, German signals lost coherence. Officers struggled to control scattered squads. The terrain offered them fewer hiding places. Yet they still attempted to direct final pockets of resistance. Emil knew that these moments required absolute precision. Each successful mark reduced chaos. Each mark prevented additional casualties. The next engagement occurred near an abandoned stable with collapsed rafters. German troops had taken positions near the rear, using broken stalls for cover. Their officer directed them through a narrow hallway connecting the stable to another structure. The hallway was dark. Dust fell from the rafters. Identifying movement inside was nearly impossible. The lieutenant motioned for Emil. He crawled behind a fallen gate. He raised the scope. He watched the hallway. For long seconds nothing appeared. Then a brief silhouette crossed the opening. Emil aligned the shutter. The puff rose. The code passed. Mortars struck the hallway entrance. The officer fell. The squad inside broke into disorganized retreat. Riflemen captured the stable with minimal struggle. As they secured the block, the battalion intelligence officer arrived with 2 runners. He approached Emil. He said reports from multiple companies indicated the same pattern. Wherever the shutter gap device had been used, the time needed to neutralize command elements had fallen sharply. Casualties dropped. Advances accelerated. He asked Emil detailed questions about the mechanism. He listened closely to each explanation. He wrote down the specifications in his notebook. He said the report would move up the chain once the city was fully secured. Emil felt the weight of responsibility increase. The device had begun as a simple idea built from a flaw. Now it shaped the tempo of an entire sector's advance. He understood that careful documentation mattered. If others were to build the device, they needed exact details. He promised to prepare a full set of notes when time allowed. The company continued toward the heart of St. Lo. Resistance shrank into a final cluster of buildings near a destroyed marketplace. Officers still commanded small groups from attic spaces and narrow stairwells. The sergeant instructed Emil to stay close. They expected several quick engagements requiring rapid marking. The last major confrontation occurred near a collapsed merchant hall. German officers moved between beams to direct their final stand. Their movements were frantic. They understood the end had come but attempted to delay it. Allied riflemen needed an exact strike to break the defense. Emil positioned himself behind a thick stone slab. He raised the scope. Dust drifted through a gap in the wall. A faint profile appeared behind a leaning timber. Emil centered the shutter. It triggered cleanly. The puff rose. The signal passed. Mortars landed across the timber. The officer fell. The defense crumbled. The lieutenant looked across the ruins and exhaled. He placed a hand on Emil's shoulder. He said that the device had saved lives. Without it, they would have fought a far slower and riskier battle. Emil nodded once. He understood the meaning. Innovation built from necessity had changed the course of their advance. The morning light began to break through the drifting smoke. The last defenders surrendered. The Battle of St. Lo had ended. The city lay in ruins, but control had shifted. Forward teams moved through the streets to clear remaining hazards. Emil sat on a low wall. He removed the capsule housing from the shutter. He examined the spring. He wiped soot from the mechanism. His hands moved with practiced precision. The device had served its purpose. Its value had been proven. Through days of relentless testing. The lieutenant approached again. He asked Emil what he intended to do with the scope once the sector stabilized. Emil said he would repair it fully. He said he would preserve the mechanism exactly as it was. The lieutenant agreed. He said Division Command would likely want to see it. The smoke cleared slowly. The streets grew quiet. The device that began as an unnoticed flaw had marked the officers who shaped the fight. It had given Allied forces a tool that saved time, saved effort, and saved men in a place where seconds mattered. Emil stood up. He placed the scope in its canvas wrap. He walked toward the assembly point with the rest of the unit.